Hey everybody, this is just Megan here, one of the Fat Girl Chronicle podcasters. I just wanted to let you know that this week the podcast can get a little bit heavy and we're talking about things like mental health and body image. So the first half is a little bit more deep and can be triggering to some. So just go into the podcast knowing that it might bring up some feelings. Certainly, if you have some feelings that are brought up, we encourage you to reach out, seek help. If you're watching this on YouTube, we will comment below with some numbers in case you do need to reach out. Otherwise, we hope you enjoy, and thank you again for listening.
Shining bright, sunshine in the sky, Megan and Tammy here to testify, spreading love, laughter and good vibes too. The Fat Girl Chronicles, we're breaking through. No more.
Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Fat Girl Chronicles. I am Tammy.
And I'm Megan.
And together we are the
Fat Girl Flippers.
Today we're going to talk about something that a lot of us struggle with, and that's mental health.
Yeah. So, and before we start that, I do want to just say, if you're watching us on YouTube, make sure to hit that little bell thingy so it'll remind you every Friday that we're around. And we are also on a ton of different podcast platforms, and that includes Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, all the good stuff. So make sure you are listening to us on there as well. Yeah.
And when you want to see our beautiful faces, just flip right over to YouTube.
Yes. Yeah, and make sure you comment below. You've been really commenting back on people.
Well, I've been trying to.
Yeah.
It's hard sometimes, but I like to see the comments, and the comments are what drives our algorithm, which puts us back into the flow of things on YouTube.
Yeah. No, we do. We love to see the comments and people sharing their stories, and so keep commenting, keep watching, and share with your friends the different podcasts that we have.
Don't forget, if you're on YouTube, to subscribe. That's
the
important thing for YouTube, is to get you subscribed.
Subscribers. So we're going to talk about mental health today.
Yeah.
Yes. We did do a podcast a while back, I think, on mental health.
We just touched on it briefly and said that we were going to talk more about our own journeys of mental health. And I think that's probably what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
Is a little bit about each of us and our journey.
Mr. Archie.
Archie's underneath, of course. So do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So both of us really have had our own journey with mental health. And I feel like one thing about mental health is that it can be so isolating and also overwhelming, because there's in my practice or my education, we're introduced to the DSM-5, which has all the mental health diagnosis, and it can be there's so many things. Mm-hmm. There's so many letters that you can have.
So many. It's the alphabet. We always say that we're part of the alphabet club.
Yeah.
There's so many different personality disorders. There's different mental health issues like anxiety and depression, and
absolutely,
there's so many different things that you can slots that they can put you in.
And it's so it can be really overwhelming. The other thing about Nova Scotia, and I mean a little bit of Canada, but there's some provinces that aren't dealing with it as much as we are, is the lack of doctors. So getting a referral although you can do self-referral for mental health here. But that might not be the case for other people. And then also we have recently learned that we have followers across the world. So in the States, for example, it might be really costly to go and get a diagnosis.
Shout out to the people in Sweden who are listening to us, because we look at our stats, and Megan just pointed it out to me today, and I just wanted to say, shout out to you guys, because the major amount of our followers,
almost 50%
on the podcast, are from Sweden. So welcome and thank you.
It was interesting.
It is interesting.
It's super cool to see that people all over the world are listening, I guess, because we were talking about podcasts more so. But yeah, even if you're just listening on the podcast, we would encourage you to go on YouTube too and hit that subscribe button. Because that would be really cool.
Yeah,
to have
and
like
we would
international
love
on YouTube.
Yeah, we would love if you're from Sweden. Norway was another country. France. Any of those places, if you're from there and you're listening to us on the podcast, like Megan said, head over to YouTube and just leave us a comment and let us know that you're from one of those countries, and we would love to have interaction with you. And maybe there'll come a point where we can bring you on as a virtual guest.
That would be cool. That would be so cool.
Yeah.
I'd love to learn what plus size life is like
In other parts of the world.
Because I'm sure it's so different. Like we're going to end up talking specifically what it's like in Nova Scotia, but our mental health system could be even different than, Alberta or, Ontario and all the other provinces, let alone countries.
And that's the one thing maybe we should speak on is in Canada, our healthcare system, although it's so-called free, we pay high
Quote, unquote,
taxes, which is what covers our healthcare is our tax money. And each province is allotted a certain amount of money for healthcare, and it comes from the federal government, but then the province is responsible to manage that money.
Right.
So each province in Canada handles their own healthcare. So you may live next to a province that has different benefits, or you may have better benefits than them.
Yeah, actually an example that I can think of is, so to really practice clinical work, which would be like therapeutic work with a social work degree in Nova Scotia, typically, and I'm not going to say for sure because there's always loopholes and exceptions and everything else, typically you'd have to have your master's at the very least. And even with your master's, they're now, the Association of Social Workers is starting to come out with, you have to do another step to be able to practice clinically. Now, in New Brunswick, there are people who are practicing mental health professionals who have their Bachelor of Social Work. They don't have their master's, they just have their bachelor's, who are practicing. Now, these professionals typically aren't covered under like work insurance or anything because of whatever reason, but their rates would be cheaper. And they do, usually what I'm finding is that a lot of people are doing it like virtually and stuff, but so that would be a difference. Like New Brunswick is literally 2 seconds from us.
Yeah, we drive an hour and we're in New Brunswick.
We're in New Brunswick, so it's super close to us, but you would be hard pressed to see somebody with their Bachelor of Social Work practicing here, if that's even allowed really, but in New Brunswick it is. So just super close, but also very different. Yeah,
and not just from a practicing point of view, but from a patient point of view, very different systems.
Yeah.
Because each province does run their own, so the intake process, we can speak of the intake process and what happens here in Nova Scotia, but it may not be the same all across Canada. But it will give you an idea of what we've gone through and what happens here.
Yeah. So we really wanted to do this podcast. We were talking about what to do, and I had suggested this, and I know Tammy is a big advocate for mental health too. We really wanted to do this to really show that, we don't just talk the talk, but we're trying to walk the walk, and we're also trying to normalize mental health and that process of trying to get help, because that can be really foreign to some people.
And I think it's really important to note that most people who have issues with their weight or are overweight, there can be medical reasons behind it, but there also can be mental health reasons behind it. A lot of people have food addictions and things because of trauma in their past. And I mean, that could be a trigger, so we want to just kind of put that out there that, this may be triggering for some people, but people who are overweight a lot of times or plus size are dealing with mental health issues because they may have had trauma in the past, and that could be the reason, for a lot of different things.
Yeah. And I mean, this could be a podcast in and of itself, but so I've been really I've always been passionate about, in school, in some schools they actually call it fat studies. So I've always been very interested in kind of talking about fat phobia and how our culture looks at fat bodies and everything in my studies. And so one thing I've learned years ago is that there's a thing called adverse childhood experiences, and it's basically a questionnaire on different scenarios as a child. And then you get a score, and I think it's the higher the score,
Isn't
not the lower.
There's 9 questions, I think.
Yeah, it's very short. Like the higher the score, it's basically saying the higher the score, the more likely you are to experience some sort of health condition or some sort of
Mental health,
whether it's physical or mental, later in life. And it just shows like that stuff that happens in childhood impacts your adulthood. So that particular survey, that particular tool that people use, actually came out of an obesity clinic. So that's how it originated. So I don't want to go into too many details, only because it's been so long since I've got the story straight in my head and I don't want to give false information, but it's something that you could look up. You could look up the adverse childhood experience if you're interested, and you can get the whole history of it. But it did come out of an obesity clinic, and it linked trauma to either weight gain or like fat bodies themselves. So yeah, that's just like a quick side note, but it's also not really a side note because it's still talking about mental health, right?
Yeah. And it's important. I think a lot of people feel shame for, wanting to access mental health or having mental health problems.
Yeah.
And then they don't because they feel shame.
Yeah.
But a lot of times things that happen or the reason you're having these issues may not even be your own fault. It could be your childhood. It could be hereditary. There's a lot of reasons why people have mental health issues.
For sure. So I guess I'll get right into it unless you wanted to share your story first.
Go ahead.
So really, I mean, I was in junior high when I saw my first therapist. It was actually a clinical social worker, oddly enough. So like mental health has kind of always been a part of my life. At that point, I was diagnosed with depression through that clinic, but that was really the only kind of label or title that I was given at that age. And I was young. I mean, junior high's young. So, I kind of went through the rest of, I didn't really start looking more into labels until within the last year or two. So really I went through a huge period of time where it was just like, oh, I'm kind of labeled as depressed. I didn't connect with depression. I connected more with anxiety. I've always had high anxiety. I continue to have high anxiety, but as I got older, I noticed that my connection with depression really, it just was like not as significant as it was with my anxious thoughts. And I knew that I had anxious thoughts. So as I started working for the agency I work for now, and in that particular workplace, they really encourage like self-care and taking care of yourself and understanding yourself better. And I've always struggled with food, as Tammy knows. Everybody that knows me knows I struggle with food. So I'm super, super picky. I'm pretty sure I talked about it on this podcast before. Very picky. I eat like an extremely picky child is basically what it is. Very like limited amounts of food. I don't like, for example, to eat peas with potatoes. I like peas with rice and corn with potatoes, like that sort of thing. And so that my eating has been excessive, but also like I can't stand, like I really struggle with change. So like, for example, if I was on call and I get a call, I'd have to go in last minute. Like it would really kind of set me off. I really don't like sudden change of plans. I always feel socially awkward, even though I'm told multiple times that I'm not socially awkward. In my brain, I am. And so little things like that. I'm really sensitive. So like I love Tammy for the fact that she has lotion in her bathroom, because I hate washing my hands. If I come out of the shower, I have to put lotion immediately on as soon as my hands get wet. So, Tammy, God love her, has lotion so I can wash my hands and then put lotion on immediately. And I've had almost panic attacks over like getting out of the pool and not having lotion, and my hands like almost like spread and my fingers spread and it's like I can't move them and I'm like panicking. It's the feel of it. So things like that. Sensitivity to textures, sounds, whatever. So through that, my sister was going through the social work program herself, and we have this thing called the Dalhousie Social Work Clinic, and they do free assessments. So I got in contact with them, and I actually wanted to receive an assessment for autism. So this is where my journey began. I wanted to be assessed to see if I had autism. And for anybody who's wondering, so that's kind of what we want to talk about, is like putting, like, allowing people behind the curtain. So for anyone who's wondering about what that assessment looks like, is you do a pre-assessment, you fill out a bunch of paperwork, you have to like ask your parents or however you gain the information about like if there was any difficulties during your birth, if you had any developmental issues. And this can be a barrier because I mean, I was fortunate enough to have two parents I could ask. Not everybody's so lucky, right? So that, again, barrier number one, really. And then, so you do your pre-thing, then I went in, and it's like a couple of hours. I went in the morning, and I didn't leave until early afternoon. And it was just questions around, you know, my social life, my thoughts and feelings around different scenarios. They even had me read a book, and I had to, like, describe the book. It was so weird. So, just, like, a question after question after question after question. And so through that process, before I left, they said that women are often really hard to diagnose with autism because they're so socially conditioned to what people call mask, which is like kind of pretend. So women are conditioned to be really social creatures and to really be, you know, a certain type of way around people. And so if you're able to have that ability to be social, that really hinders your chance of being diagnosed with autism because you're social. So, so she mentioned that one, and then she also mentioned that I needed further testing for anxiety, which, shocker, was not a shocker at all. So at that point, you know, once you do the assessment, in my experience, with this particular assessment, they didn't give me anything right away. She was able to kind of basically hint that she didn't think I had autism, but that we should definitely do some testing for like anxiety disorders. So I did that, and then we did the rest of it online. I was tested for anxiety disorders, but also PTSD. I don't know if you want to talk about, like, so I was diagnosed with PTSD as well, and I found the evaluation for that really weird. So in my experience, the evaluation is you have to tell them, like, they list off a bunch of different like traumatic events, like it can be anything, like from if you're in war, like just different scenarios where there would be trauma, a murder, whatever. And you have to like say kind of which events that had occurred for you. And then you kind of have to like rate them. And then you have to talk about your most traumatic event in more detail. So it was weird. I didn't like it.
It's triggering.
It's triggering, but it also, in my, you know, experience, so like I basically, like I've not had one traumatic event. Like, it's been continuous events, whether it's like a same person or different people. So like, it's really hard to like, you know, I didn't like witness something traumatic, or I didn't have like one experience of a really traumatic event. It was like more chronic. And so I found the assessment really difficult. So anyone who's like looking into that, it's really difficult if you've experienced chronic traumatic events.
And if I'm not incorrect, because I've been diagnosed with it as well, is they call it complex PTSD. When you have trauma that occurs multiple times over and over and over again, and it can be the same trauma or it can be different trauma, but in the same way.
Yeah. So I even though it might not have been the most traumatic, and I'm saying this in quotes because this is like all ridiculous to rate your traumaticness of things. I picked an event where I could kind of scoop the multiple events into one because it was the same event happening multiple times. So I could kind of lump it into one. So I chose that one versus another one where that was more chronic and more hard to explain. That's the other thing. Like, if your trauma comes from emotional abuse, it's really like it's so much easier to be able to describe other forms of abuse in those assessments. And so that makes my heart feel for those people who haven't maybe not experienced any sort of physical stuff, but have experienced years of emotional abuse,
Psychological,
right?
mental, like
Yeah.
what you're saying.
So it's really,
Yeah.
I feel
my
for
head is
people.
going all over the place because I'm
Relating.
with you. I'm on
Yeah.
the same journey. So
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, I did that assessment, and then they also, for the autism one, they also ask like for other people. So my husband was part of that, and also my parents were part of that. So they would talk to them about, and they again ask questions like, what are your observations? Do you feel, they do this or that? Or has she always been picky with food? Like that sort of thing. So ultimately, what the decision was at that time was autistic traits, social anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder, and PTSD. So those were the diagnoses. I will say there's some diagnosis as we go on in my journey that I will disclose, but there's some I won't. And, the reality of mental health is that even though we are all like, I think of it like Bell Let's Talk days, there's still a lot of diagnoses that are super stigmatized. So like, rather than, so even people who talk about mental health and are in the mental health field or advocates for mental health, even people who are like professionals or you may feel are really confident in themselves, don't want to divulge certain diagnosis because of the stigma, right? So at this point, those are the things I was diagnosed with. And then, so that's the start of my journey. Did you want to kind of go into your journey and then I'll finish off with mine type of thing?
Yeah. For me, the first time I can remember feeling anxiety, I probably would have been 4 or 5 years old, and I remember standing in the closet and feeling like I want it to be not here. I want it to no longer be in this world,
right?
And I remember feeling like I didn't belong, and I remember being anxious all the time and worrying. Like as a little child, I remember worrying and worrying and worrying. And I'll be honest, I come from a family that has anxiety, there's depression, there's probably there are a lot of undiagnosed mental health issues because the family that I grew up in is not very open when it comes to talking about mental health issues or admitting that they possibly have anything wrong with them or seeking treatment.
The cycles continue.
And there were also mental health issues in their families, so it's generational.
Of course.
So mine started early as a child, but I was always told, stop crying, stop being so sensitive, don't this, don't that.
Over dramatic. I heard that all being a drama queen and stuff. Yeah.
So there was a lot of that. And as that happened, like don't chew your fingernails, don't stop crying or those kind of things. And as that happened, it made my anxiety and I guess depression, even as a child, worse. Yeah. So I really don't remember a time when I ever felt without that.
Yeah, I totally relate.
And so my first experience with anything mental health wise, because like I said, I grew up in a family that didn't talk about it. It was a stigmatized thing. would have been after my son was born. I felt like I needed some counseling, and it was something that was offered at the job I was working at. I had EAP or whatever it's called, the Employee Assistance Program.
Yes, they're great for like, so they're like short-term counseling.
Yeah, so that was my first foray into getting some counseling, and I was diagnosed with major depressive disorder and anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder.
Yeah.
And that was the start. And that was just a very brief foray into the mental health journey. And as things went on and things happened in my life and more trauma happened, then I started to seek more help because I had to.
Yeah.
And I, like you, was diagnosed with a few more things, and I also got the PTSD diagnosis. And for me, the mental health journey really, really started when I moved home from Belize.
Right.
And Megan knows because that's how I met Megan.
Yeah, leaps and bounds. Like,
yes.
Yeah.
I will say, probably in the most vulnerable state I've ever been in my life. And, there were multiple attempts. And I know that's probably not something we're supposed to say on here, so we might have to bleep that out, but...
yeah, I'll take care of it, and I'll make sure we do like an intro that triggers. Yeah. Archie.
Anyway, so during that time is when I luckily was introduced to a counselor at the hospital, and I was given a 1-year intensive therapy program, which I, at that time, just grabbed onto. And it was there that I got the multiple diagnosis and the PTSD diagnosis and everything after I went through the testing, just like you.
Yeah.
And it's been, like Megan said, it's been a long journey, but it's been leaps and bounds, and I've really discovered a lot about why I have the trauma, what happened, where it came from, how I've learned to deal with it and process it and talk about it, because I am not going to be one of those people who carries that generational trauma with me and gives it to other people. It stops here. So I want to make sure that everybody that's listening understands that there's no shame in getting help. If you have any kind of anxiety or worries, or if your family doesn't feel like that's something that you should talk about, but you don't feel right, if you don't feel right, you seek help. And don't be ashamed of it, and don't worry about what other people think. Get the help you need.
So after, I just want to touch on the generational thing first, because like you, I've always said my family is drowning in mental health. So like, there's very few people who don't have some sort of diagnosis, whether that's undiagnosed or not, within our, like, historically, like generations upon generations upon generations. Like I can think back to like a great grandmother who like moved away to another country and would only be visited. She ended up being admitted to like a psychiatric unit, and my father describes her as like sitting in a rocking chair, rocking back and forth, and like being mute. Like that's just one example, and that's like multiple generations, right? So the difference though is that I was raised in a house with 2 health professionals. And so that can be either a good thing or a bad thing. It can be a bad thing in that sometimes, I don't know who else has a parent who is like in the medical field, for example. So I have a parent who is a nurse. And so that's great because they can help with any medical advice. But sometimes it's like when it's your own kid, it's like, okay, but is it really that bad? And I'm sure that people who have parents who are either doctors or nurses or whatever can relate to that, because I think that's probably a thing. So because they're desensitized to a lot of things, right?
Yes.
The same thing was my other parent was a social worker who did have their master's and who was practicing in like counseling-esque areas. So, while it was helpful, it can also be really kind of intimidating, and it can also feel like there's blurred lines between parenting and, professional help. So it was really good in the fact that, I had parents who had some sort of an understanding of mental health, who were patient and who had the resources. They had jobs that had insurance, so I could go see that clinical social worker. Like they knew the resources. They knew, kind of what to look for. They knew the signs. They knew, about going to the doctor and looking for meds.
And weren't making you feel like there was something wrong with you that
right.
Not that there wasn't something wrong with you,
Yeah.
but they weren't making you feel ashamed for having something wrong with you.
Exactly. So that, but they are also, but again, like when we speak about trauma and generational stuff, it's like as much as we only know how to be what we're taught, you know what I mean? And so
Exactly.
or we can only parent or take care of others so much until our own trauma impacts us. So I would say again, it's generational. And, when, hopefully when I have a child or kids or whatever, like I'm able to do just a little bit better or just a little bit, be a little bit more compassionate or not have my trauma impact my parenting as much, right? Like it is so generational.
Yes.
It is.
I honestly wish that I had gotten more help before my son was born. I feel like we would have a better relationship today, and I feel like things probably wouldn't be the way they are in my family if my family had been more open
For sure.
to getting help. And one of the things, like Megan says, is, you were fortunate your parents had the resources
Yeah, they were. I was very privileged that
way.
way.
For me, my parents were just blue collar workers, so they didn't have insurance plans that could cover things like that. And we weren't the type of people, I guess, maybe people in the country can understand this, but you didn't go to the doctor unless you fell off the tractor and somebody ran you over.
Yeah.
Then you would go to the doctor. But minor things, or what they considered minor things, you would not even go.
Yep.
And mental health stuff was not even mentioned. It wasn't even on the radar.
Right.
And as I grew and learned that, that I did have issues and why I had issues and things like that, and I tried to reach out to the family, there was backlash and pushback because I think it was too close to the root of the problem.
For sure.
So.
For sure.
Yeah. And it's really hard for me to sit here and talk about this because I don't want to talk about my family like they were, the worst people in the world, but it did really have an effect on who I am today. And
as does most child.
Yeah. And I feel bad because I know that I've affected my child because of the way I was brought up, and I unfortunately didn't learn what I needed to do until it was after I had my child.
Yeah. But and that is hard and that's difficult, and I know like for people watching, Tammy's putting on a brave face right now, but I think about the people that are watching this who are in the same situation as you and realizing, because truthfully, this is the nature of the game. It's we're just trying to heal ourselves a little bit better for each generation at this point, right? So yeah.
And I don't want to be the one that's still carrying that torch with that stigma attached to it and the shame. I want to be the person who says, it's okay, I have mental health issues, but I'm dealing with it and I'm getting better every day.
Yeah. And Tammy has certainly sung my praises 1,000,001 times on this, but Tammy's right when she says that, she started at one place quite a few years ago, and you know, when she came back to Nova Scotia is what I'm talking about more specifically, you know, starting at one spot. And then, you know, that program that you took really did help, and made such a difference. And you made those connections, and the way Tammy was versus the way Tammy is now, each version of Tammy is equally worthy, equally valuable, and equally, you know, deserving of love and affection and everything else, and to be respected. But they are two different versions. And I would say one is much healthier mentally, and one has a little bit more mental freedom in some ways, right? And so Tammy really has, like, I can't express enough how much she has grown, and that's through accessing the mental health resources.
And I will say this to anybody out there who's starting the journey. It's not an easy journey, and you really have to put the work in.
Yes.
It's not something you can just read a few pamphlets and talk to a counselor a couple times. If you've had trauma and, you know, you grew up in a dysfunctional environment, which a lot of us did.
Yeah.
I was just talking to somebody yesterday about Nova Scotia seems to be full of things, like so many different things happen in so many little pockets, and we have
There's a lot of rural communities,
where things were done that were never ever talked about, that were not nice.
No, and isolated, right? Like, you know,
and some people even grew to feel that those were normal.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because that's all they knew.
Absolutely.
And I was one of those people.
Yeah. So I do want to say though, like, through, like, Tammy's right, like, when she started the group stuff, like when she started the programming, I mean, this was like, that was her routine. She absolutely devoted herself to mental health and her mental health services, like devoted for years. And so, and not that she's not devoted now, but she doesn't have to be as devoted because she's done a lot of the work. Yeah. And so, you know, certainly we don't want to say this to be like, you have to, like, give up everything you're doing now and attend therapy, like, every day. But, you know, it is important to recognize.
That was what I did basically for a whole year. I had intensive therapy. Mm-hmm. I remember this like it was yesterday, even though it was like 7 years ago. But Monday I would do my reports for the week, and Tuesday I would meet with the group and we would do group therapy. And then on Thursday I would meet with the counselor and have one-on-one therapy. Mm-hmm. And then I would have to record things on diary cards every day. I would have to journal every day. I would have to pass this in to the counselor the next week. And you had to be accountable or they didn't let you come back to the group. And I so bad wanted to get well that I just totally latched onto that because I had nothing else.
Yeah, it certainly does. It's just like anything else, right? Like I said, like, I mean, all our positions in this world, like, I would not be in the position to be able to do that because I need to work or whatever. But, like, you know, I really like what you're saying is that you do need to work, whether it's, you know, it's not just like, you know, your cured thing. Like, mental health really is like a lifetime of things. And, you know, it's just like you're taking care of any sort of physical, like diabetes. You're not going to, like, give yourself insulin and be cured of diabetes one day. Like, no. Like, might be having to take insulin every day, or Ozempic, or checking your blood sugar. Like, you can't just check it one day and say, oh, it looks low, I'm cured. Like, that just doesn't happen that way, and mental health is the same. Yeah. So for anyone in Nova Scotia, this might be of interest. So once I did my autism and anxiety assessments, I felt that there was some things missing. And so mental health assessments are expensive if you do private, like thousands of dollars expensive. Mm-hmm. So I kind of had two options. I could self-refer to mental health, which is our, like, provincial mental health. And there's a long wait list for that. But I went through a clinic called Inspired Medical Living. So my doctor, again, I'm fortunate to have a doctor, a family doctor. My family doctor did a referral for Inspired Medical Living, and basically I was able to receive a free evaluation. So they do free evaluations with a psychiatrist and it's covered through MSI, which is like our healthcare. Is that how you describe it? Yeah, through our healthcare plan. So I did that, and then through that, again, I got a couple of different diagnoses. The ones I'll share are the generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, and PTSD, which I already had, but they were confirmed. But then I also got the, it's that major depressive disorder. And I also received binge eating disorder. She tested me for ADHD, and it runs in my family. I do not have ADHD. And then some other disorders. So those were like the ones that I'm going to share, but it was interesting to hear so for major depressive disorder, because again, I don't really kind of relate with depression as much as I do anxiety. I'm high anxiety. What did she say? She said it's like walking through your daily life or walking through mud every day. You can get through life, but you're walking through sludge so it's just a little harder.
And for me, the scenario was, it's like you're carrying 2 suitcases with you all the time. And you never get to put them down. You're always carrying them.
So it's you can, it's people are because when you hear about depression, one of my things is when you hear about depression, you see that person lying in bed and they're you can't move. And for a lot of people,
that's not the case.
And that might be the case for some. But I like the fact that it's no, you can still get through, because it's sometimes people think depression is you can't get through life at all. You're just trapped in the bed. And that's not been my experience.
And it wasn't mine either, because until I was diagnosed with a lot of this really bad stuff, I worked a full-time job. I had a family. Yeah. I was doing the normal things that everybody else was doing. But I still was managing to juggle those suitcases, whether I had them strapped to my back or on top of my head or wherever they were. Those 2 suitcases were still with me, and they were major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder, and then the PTSD. Yeah. And I can't remember what the name of it is, but it's a skin picking disorder. I have that, and I have OCD tendencies and a few other things that, Megan, we're not going to disclose everything that we have. Yeah. But yeah, so you're carrying a lot with you, and you may not even realize you're carrying it.
Yeah, I liked the sludge, because it was she's yes, Megan, you can get through life. You can get up, you can go to work, whatever. But it's just walking through sludge. It slows you down. It makes it a little bit harder to cross that path if you're walking through a bunch of sludge or mud or whatever, right? That's slowing you down. I just really liked Archie. I really like Archie too, but I really liked her analogy. I don't know what he's doing, but I feel like
he's getting in. He's getting in the chair.
Okay, hold on. I'll fix the phone. You keep talking.
Yeah, so like Megan's saying, you're carrying it or you're walking through it, whatever you're doing. Sorry that we had that little faux pas with the little man there. I don't know why he does this every time we do the podcast.
I know, he loves us doing podcasts.
But yeah, so don't be ashamed if you feel like you're trudging along and you might feel like everyone looks at you and thinks that you have everything all together, because I know that there's a lot of people in my family who from the outside look like they've got it all together, but if you lived with them, you would see a different side of them, and you would know that there were definitely mental health issues that are unaddressed. So
yeah, and I think that's also important. It's when we talk about mental health, with my journey, for example, I know it's cozy. For my example, people if I said to them I've had family members and I've said I have social anxiety, and the laughing that happens, what? You do not have social anxiety. I can tell you right now, you don't have social anxiety. Reality is I do. And so I think it's important for people to know that like you really don't know what somebody's going through. And for my journey specifically, people would think that I'm like happy-go-lucky, I'm super positive, I've got no struggles, you know, I've got my full-time job, I'm doing Fat Girl Flippers, I've on different boards, you know, like I've got family, friends, whatever. But you really don't know what's going on, you know.
At the end of the day, Megan still has to go to bed with herself.
Yes.
And you carry that with you. No matter whether you're juggling 50,000 other things, you're still carrying that with you.
Yeah. So like even if you have a friend who, you know, comes up to you and says, I'm really struggling with this, it's important to be compassionate and understanding and support them versus trying to like either immediately fix the situation by saying, oh, you don't, like, no way you have that, you're so whatever. Like, I'm sure this is just a temporary thing. Like, don't dismiss, because that happens all the time.
A lot, yeah.
Especially since we're talking about things that are invisible. But also, like, you know, when it comes to you, like, even if you feel like, you know, people have it worse or you're doing well, you can still be struggling, right?
That's one thing I really dislike is
the
people who say, well, yeah, you have that, but think of the people that, you know, don't have any legs, or think of the people that don't have this or don't have that. I think that people need to be allowed to have,
yes,
you know, have your disorder or whatever it is that you have wrong with you.
Yes.
And not feel guilty because you're not as bad off as
yes,
so-and-so. So people out there, if you could refrain from saying that, because it really is unfair, because you seriously do not know what people are carrying in their heads.
You don't. And I think, yeah, like the whole, you could have it much worse.
Yeah.
This person has it worse. Or, the reality is that people, just like DNA, just like our fingerprints,
everybody's different.
Everybody's different, and everybody reacts to something different. I could witness something. So for example, if I were to go to, if I were to be at work and I'm chatting with somebody and they put their hand, like as we're just chatting, and they're like, go to slap me on the knee, but they put their hand slightly above my knee, because of an experience that I had, I would be insanely triggered. I would be very triggered by that. Nobody would think anything of it, right? Like that, somebody could have that same experience. I could go to Tammy and touch right above her knee and she not think anything of it. But for me, that would be extremely triggering, especially if it was a male. It would be extremely triggering. And so we have to remember that people have different traumas. They might even have the same trauma, but react to the trauma differently or be more triggered by that trauma, right? It's so different for everyone.
For me, it's the people when they tell you, stop crying. Because I am very, very sensitive. And I can cry.
Both, girl.
Yeah, and I can cry very easily. And I often feel the emotions of somebody else. I'm very empathetic to what's going on with other people. And I've had really bad experiences with men where they get very, very angry if you cry. And in some cases, crying is therapeutic. It releases something in you.
I'd absolutely encourage a good cry.
Yeah.
1,000%.
But for me, growing up in an environment where it was, what are you crying for? Stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about, you know?
Yes.
That. And then with men who were the kind of, why are you crying? What is wrong with you? Will you just stop that? You know, like, and that would make it worse for me, because I would feel like nobody ever validated your feelings. Like, it was like you were never allowed to be sad about anything.
Yeah.
Like, if your pet died, for example, in my family, you didn't cry about that. Like, you weren't allowed to mourn things, or like it was seen as shameful. And I'm so glad that I've learned that those things it's okay to cry.
It is absolutely. I think that's important, the validation piece. So like if you do have someone in your life that's struggling with mental health, you know, really validating, even when you're wanting to, I had a teacher at NSCC. So even if there's something that you want to kind of quote unquote confront them on, like if they're having like a thought that might be harmful or that you might want to challenge, he always called it carefrontation. So always being compassionate and always kind of validating what the person is going through and maybe offering a different point of view if that's appropriate, you know? So Archie's coming over. But I also think validating yourself too, like validating your own emotions, because sometimes it's hard, like it's easy to say to a friend, you know, oh my gosh, you are going through a lot right now, like absolutely, or oh, you know what, you do tend to have anxious thoughts a lot, or like whatever, like it's easy to validate other people, but it's important to validate yourself too, and whatever you're going through. Like one of the things that I really struggled with cognitive behavioral therapy, which is like essentially rewiring your brain and your thoughts. Yeah.
For anybody who's wants the letters.
Abbreviations. I always struggled with that because one of my things is negative self-talk, like really nasty negative self-talk. So like instead of saying to myself, instead of like noticing the thought and like kindly trying to either reframe it or change that thought, it'd be like, you are so effing stupid. Why are you thinking like that? Why are you catastrophizing this? Or why are you thinking this way? You need to think this way. So I would never say that to like Tammy or anyone else struggling, but to me. So just like validating your own feelings, I think is important, and talking to yourself in a compassionate way, like I think is also.
I struggle with that as well, and you know, really negative self-talk a lot. Mm-hmm. I find it hard, especially when I'm alone, and then you get in that mode of everything's wrong and you can't fix anything, and then it's just like down that rabbit hole we go.
Yeah.
Negative self-talk. But you're right, because a lot of times you will point it out to me, you know, don't talk to yourself like that, or you know, like look at it in a different way or whatever. But then you can't do it for yourself.
I know. It's
and
the hardest
so
thing.
Hard.
It's the hardest thing. Asking yourself, like, what would you tell your friend? Maybe that's like a strategy.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, like it's mental health is so complex, and it's like it's so internal. You know, like it's so like you can see there's a lot of physicalness to it. Like your body is impacted by your mental health, whether it's like being tired or a sore body, aches and pains, that sort of thing. But like it's it manifests itself.
When I first got diagnosed with major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder, they also diagnosed me at the same time with fibromyalgia, which was interesting because that's also another disease that's invisible.
Yes. And it's highly associated, isn't it? Like highly associated with mental health? Yeah.
Yes.
So there is like physical aspects to it, but you know, it's really hard for people to be like, to be sympathetic. Like people are more sympathetic to a broken arm or to even invisible physical like diabetes or a heart condition or whatever.
Cancer or whatever, you know, like
people tend to be more sympathetic to that than mental health. And I'm not quite sure why, but we have been making kind of small leaps and bounds.
Yeah.
I still think, like I said, two strong advocates who have been pretty open about everything still aren't even willing to share certain diagnoses just because stigma. Yeah. Right? So there is still a lot of stigma around and a lot of shame around certain diagnoses. And
kudos to the people out there who
can share
everything, because you're helping us along with our journey, and eventually, hopefully, we will be able to share as well. But just the situations that both of us are in right now, there's diagnoses that if we shared, probably we would be stigmatized, and it's unfortunate.
It is unfortunate. So, you know, if anything, I hope that this particular episode shares that you're not alone if you're struggling with your mental health.
For sure.
Anxiety, is a real thing. Both of us struggle with anxiety. And I want to point out also that social anxiety isn't about just being anxious about social situations. My social anxiety happens somewhat during the social situation, but a lot afterwards. So that includes thoughts of like, so just so you guys are thinking about that.
Here we go.
Like thoughts
Rumination,
of like,
right?
Yeah, rumination. Thoughts about if you walk into a room that everyone's looking at you, everybody's talking about you. Thoughts about like that people are going home and like, for example, I gave a speech this past weekend at a wedding. Like, I'm still thinking about all the negative things people are probably, or see, there you go. Probably no one's saying anything, but I just said probably speaking about me. That's likely not even the case.
For me, it's going over in my head every conversation that I had with every person,
every
and
detail.
everything that I said, and did I offend somebody? Did I say it the wrong way? And I mean, even at times I will come to you and I will say, I said this, like, and you'll be like, so, kind of like, so what? That's just normal or whatever.
Yeah.
But me, I'll be thinking in my head, oh my God, they took that the wrong way. But you really have to learn to, number one, what I've had to learn is stop and think about what you're going to say. Take a minute. You don't necessarily have to answer every question as someone throws it at you.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, once you've taken a minute and you've organized your thoughts, try to go a little easy on yourself about thinking about what other people think, because really it doesn't matter what other people think.
Yeah. What I always say, what people think is none of your business.
And I was so glad when you learned that and shared that with me. That was like the revelation of revelations for me, because
I mean, it's hard
I
to live
worry
by, but
constantly about what people are thinking about me, what they're saying about me, what they're doing about me. Like, it's just, it's in my brain 100% of the time. But I've learned to have self-talk that isn't negative. So I'll say to myself, it doesn't matter what they think. You do what makes you happy. It doesn't matter what they think. Because at the end of the day, they aren't the one running your life. They're not paying your bills.
Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to talk briefly about, the social anxiety piece, just because that was the one diagnosis that, like, when I got diagnosed with generalized anxiety,
people don't understand that.
Yeah, like, with generalized anxiety, people were like, absolutely, you have that. Like, they didn't question it. The social anxiety piece, they did. And even, like, I ultimately didn't get diagnosed with, I got diagnosed with autistic traits versus a full diagnosis of autism, because of how I am socially, like, because I'm able to mask a lot. So, I wanted people to kind of understand a little bit more about social anxiety, because, you may have it and think, well, I can still, handle a crowd. That's not really what, like, it can be what social anxiety is about, but it's not 100% what it's about.
I had a hard time with that diagnosis as well, because I also have social anxiety.
Yeah.
And I was the same. I was thinking, well, I'm okay in a crowd. Like, I can...
Yeah, we can go to an event or whatever.
Yeah, but it's not just about that. It's like we said,
it's a little
about
deeper.
Thinking about things afterwards and worrying so much about what people think of you and about what you said. And
yeah, absolutely.
Did you stand the correct way? Were you wearing the right color shoes? Like all those things.
Oh, I know.
And it's the after effects. It's always when you go home with yourself, because eventually it's only you and your brain, right?
Yeah. So you're not alone. Get help if you need. I mean, I would encourage anybody to, like, seek out therapy or some sort of counseling.
Absolutely.
And
regardless. Especially if you have children.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid to break that generational curse.
Yeah.
It's scary and it's a long journey, but man, it is so worth it, and it is so freeing to not carry that baggage.
And it's never too late. Like, I mean, I think, Tammy, you're a prime example of that, right?
I'm 55 years old, and it's only now that I'm starting to feel like, even a year ago, I wouldn't have been able to sit here and talk about this way.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have. I couldn't have got the words out. I would have been crying. I couldn't have done it.
Yeah. It's wild, like, to think about the growth.
Oh.
Like, really?
Yeah, and when I began this journey, I wouldn't have even known those things. I wouldn't have known that that's why I was the way I was.
Yeah.
I didn't even have the capacity to know that.
Yeah. So if you are, like, I can't speak to other places, but if you are in Nova Scotia and needed help finding some resources, we certainly love to help anyone. So, like, feel free to message us on Fat Girl Flippers on Facebook. That's probably the best way to reach us. Outside of Nova Scotia, we really don't know. If you have resources from a different province or a different country that you'd like to share, comment on the YouTube or message us on Fat Girl Flippers on Facebook, and we can comment on the YouTube. Because certainly there's people from other areas listening.
The other thing that's great here in this province, Nova Scotia, is we have 211, which is a service that can point you in the right direction. And we also have 811, which will allow you to speak with a registered nurse who will also be able to put you in touch with resources. And we have the crisis line, the provincial crisis line that you can call. And they also are able to put you in touch with resources.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. Okay, well, another episode done. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
No, I just want to say to all the people out there who are struggling and, you know, have had a hard go of it, it's worth it in the end, and get yourself some help. Try to get yourself, advocate for yourself, and don't carry that generational curse.
Yeah. All right, we'll see you next week.
All right,
Love
bye.
ya. Mwah.
Hiding, no more feeling small. We're taking up space, standing proud and tall. Our voice is strong, our stories to be heard. Challenging the stereotypes, flipping